Hi everyone, and I hope you're doing well. This is the tutorial part 3, which we're going to focus on the layer and scene manager available inside 3D Studio Max. If you have a current scene open, what I'd like you to do is go to the 3 Max sign in the top left corner, click on that, and I want you to click the reset button. This will reset 3D Studio Max, and obviously if it asks you if there's any changes that you need, if there are, please save them. If there are not, click don't save. It'll ask you, do you really want to reset? You click yes, and it will revert everything in 3D Studio Max back to the default state. So it's really important to do that after you work on a file. Save your scene, reset it if you're going to work on something else, because it just means it's going to clear up all the default information inside 3D Studio Max to go back to a nice default. So in our scene and layer manager, I should say, we know that it's on the left side of our screen here, and we have two options available to us. We can work in sort by layer, or sort by hierarchy. Now, I normally like to work in sort by layer because it presents us a whole bunch of different options. I just expanded the menu a bit by clicking on the bar here and making it slightly bigger so that I can see all the options here at the top bar. We're going to go through each of these right now. So, if you hover your mouse above any of these options, it'll actually present to you what that option does. We can toggle display toolbar, which turns on and off this left toolbar. So to describe what this left toolbar is, this is telling you what you can see in your layers. If you turn off one of these options, for instance, I can turn off all geometry. It will not show any of the geometry. If I create a couple of boxes in 3D Studio Max right now, and then I click off show geometry, it will not show the geometry in the scene layer manager. Now this will not hide it in our actual scene, it will just hide it in our layers so that we don't have to see it. For instance, if you have a camera in your scene, then if you hide geometry, then you can only see your cameras, your lights, your helpers, your space warps, everything else. So this is essentially 3D Studio Max's way of creating a filter system for you. So I usually like to keep this on, but normally I don't disable anything. So you can actually just click that off and you get a nice comfy scene and layer manager just like that. So after we turned off the toggle display toolbar, there's also lock cell editing. So this means we're not able to alter or move objects around in our layers. You'll notice I'm left clicking and trying to drag one of these layers above another or below another, and I cannot do that. This just locks that. So this is the create new layer button. I'm going to click on create new layer, and I suggest you do too as well, because if I do, you'll notice that I actually created a new layer. Now I had box 002 highlighted while I created a new layer, so it automatically went to my new layer. So I can rename this actual layer right away. It actually asked me for a name. It's layer 001 right now, but I can rename this to anything I want. I can rename it to, and I will rename this one too, let's call it City Block 3, just as an example. So now we have two layers. We have the 0 default layer, and we have City Block 3 City Block 3 layer. Now, like I mentioned in our previous videos, anything inside 3D Studio Max that is blue is considered active. You'll notice now our 0 default layer actually has a little black icon. That means that is not the active layer. You are not working in that layer. From now on, you'll be working in this layer, City Block 3. So anything I create will actually pop into that layer. To switch between layers, all I have to do is click on this little icon beside the name of the layer, and that will turn blue, and now 0 default is active. And if I create a box, you'll notice it pops in the 0 default layer. So remember that creating new layers is exactly like working in Photoshop. The 0 default layer cannot be renamed. If you try and rename the 0 default layer by left clicking on it and hovering your mouse above it when it's blue, so if I left click on one of these objects right now, it'll turn the bar blue. If I left click again over the name of the item, it will actually ask me to rename the item. So you can rename any of these boxes in anything you like. So I call this one Batman. I'm going to left click on this layer, it turns blue. I left click again, allows me to rename. I'll call it Robin, Nightwing. And I'm just doing a naming convention just for like comic book standard Catwoman. Now all these boxes have different names. So City Block 3 we renamed simply by left clicking on the bar, turning it blue, left clicking again, and we managed to rename that really quick. Now try doing it with 0 default. Left click on the bar and it'll go blue. Left click again, it allows you to rename. Now this shows you that you can rename it, but if I type something like City Block 1, you'll notice an error pops up and says you cannot assign the default layer a new name. That's because the default layer inside 3D Studio Max is always called default. You should always create new layers for anything you're about to create. So if you were planning on making your box character scene, what I would suggest for you to do is actually make a character layer, a city layer, if you're going to add a city, or anything else in your scene would actually be on different layers. If I click OK, we get rid of this. We'll go on to the next option. So we know how to rename by left-clicking, turning the bar blue, left-clicking again, and it allows us to rename. We know how to create a new layer with the Create New Layer option. And now we can click Add to Active Layer. So what this will do is if I have this layer active, City Block 3, and I click on this box here, whoops, right like that, and I have City Block 3, and let's say I grabbed Nightwing, which is currently in City Block 3, and I click Add to Active Layer. You're going to notice it actually dragged everything over to our new active layer. Normally, what I don't really like doing that. I actually like using the left click and drag options inside the layer manager. Basically, you can left click and drag anything inside our scene and layer manager and place it in different locations. Just like in Photoshop when you're organizing layers, it works exactly like that. We can left click and drag the entire layer, which works like layer folders, we'll call them, and you can put them inside 0 default, like such. So now City Block 3 is actually a part of the 0 default layer. Or I can left click and drag it downwards into the empty space here, and we'll create a new layer again. And if I have to move boxes from one layer to another, I can left click and drag into the layers. Just like this. Whoops, sorry, I misclicked. There we go, like that. So make sure to drag them into the layers. It's like dragging them into a folder. Our layer still exists here, even though there's no models assigned to it, but we can quickly left click and drag models into it. Simple as that. We can also select children of a model. So if Nightwing actually had more objects attached to it, clicking this would select all children. If I click City Block 3, what happens if I click one of the layer folders and click Select Children, it selects everything that belongs to that layer. So if you had everything assigned to one layer, if I had all these objects a part of City Block 3, and I click on City Block 3, you'll notice it doesn't select any of the objects. We're just selecting the layer. Unless we click on a specific object, nothing is selected. Or I can click here and click Select Children, and it will select everything a part of that layer. So, to reiterate one more time, toggle display toolbar toggles the display toolbar on the left. Lock cell editing will lock all these cells in place, so I'm not able to left click and drag them anywhere. Create new layer will create a new layer. Add to active layer will add whatever we have selected to another active layer. And select children will allow you to select all the children of a layer or any objects that are attached to an object. So, and obviously we have our left click and drag method where we can left click and drag anything inside our scene and layer manager to a different location or to a different layer, like so. So just practice with that for a bit. Try and move things between layers. Try and organize your previous scenes that you've created or new scenes you've created by using that method, and that'll definitely work in your favor. If we keep going around through the options here, we have Make Selected Layer Active. So you'll notice City Block 3 is not active. You can simply click on this button, and that will make it the current active layer. You can also just left click on these black icons here, and that will do it as well. The black icon will turn blue, indicating that is now the active layer inside 3D Studio Max. A quick way to remember that is anything that is blue in 3D Studio Max means it's active. Anything that's dark gray means it's inactive. So we know that City Block 3 is active. So if I were to create an object in this layer, it works like that. And if I activate 0 default layer and create a box, it creates the box in that layer. So you can quickly click on these, or you can just click on these icons here to make a layer active of your choice. You can hide all the layers. So if I click these, it actually hides everything in our scenes. And you can also freeze all layers, which will freeze everything in the scenes. So the reason why you want to hide all layers is pretty much to empty out your scene currently. If your PC is overloading too much, it's a good way to just hide everything and sort of just work around all that and go through the options in the menus while your PC is not loading. If your PC is not currently loading too much, it's nothing really much to worry about. But the option you kind of do want to remember is freeze all layers. If you're about to show off your scene to somebody and they're playing around with the cameras and want to look around your object, you may want to freeze all the objects. We can still rotate and move and go around with our camera, but all the objects are completely frozen. You'll notice if I left click and drag, just like this with the Marquee tool, any type of select object, I cannot select any objects. That's because we froze all the objects using the freeze all layer keys. You'll notice the frozen option here in our scene layer manager is now active on all our objects. If I click that again, you'll notice they're back to dark gray, which means they're inactive. Now we can click on individual objects and freeze them. So for instance, if I had the box I called Catwoman, which is this pink box here, I can actually freeze this box simply by clicking the snowflake icon right here. This will freeze the object so I can no longer access the Catwoman box. It is still visible, it's still there, but it doesn't retain its color information, it actually freezes. This is where we're going to have to learn to go into a submenu and be able to change certain features of our 3D model so that we can see colors while it's frozen, we can see it transparent, and we can do a whole bunch of different options. So now you know a little bit about the layer manager. By going through all the default settings of the layer manager, we managed to create layers, we managed to move objects between layers, we know how to select all the children, we know how to hide objects, freeze objects. Now what I want you to do is take a quick look at the hierarchy menu. So you'll notice in the hierarchy menu, there actually isn't any layers. It's all a free-form selection for all the models, any cameras, any lights, will all just be in a generic list that go down here. Unless their models are attached to each other, you won't see them appear any different. For instance, if we had one object attached to another, and I'm just going to show you this as an example, like so, I literally just grouped up two objects together. I linked them together by just left-clicking and dragging one object onto another. So if you wanted Nightwing to move the Robin model, all I did was I left-clicked and held the left click and dragged it on top of Nightwing. And now Nightwing is the parent of Robin. Nightwing right here, if we go to the move tool, you'll notice what happens here. Nightwing and Robin are now moving together. Nightwing is considered the parent of Robin. If Nightwing moves, Robin will follow. However, if I have select Robin on its own, Robin moves on its own. It is the child of Nightwing. It can move on its own, but when Nightwing moves, it moves. The best way to remember this, and this is kind of difficult to remember, and we'll go through the steps one more time right here. I'm going to left click and drag one object to another to link them together. So Catwoman and box 008, when I left click and drag Catwoman to box 008, I'm telling Catwoman, you are the child of this object. So Catwoman is now the child of box 008. If I move the parent, the child will follow. That's the easiest way, I think, to remember the linking states of objects. If this is the parent, this is the child. The child will always follow the parent, but the child can wander off alone. Try and remember that phrase. It will help you out in realizing when you link two objects together how that will work. The parent always follows the child, but the child can always wander alone. Parent move, child move. And even if the child is far away, it doesn't matter because the two objects are linked. If I move it, just like that, they'll still follow. So the hierarchy menu is just a simpler layer manager. So layers, the layer menu works in layers, of course, and the hierarchy actually just works by how are objects linked, grouped up, or are they rigged together, and it will show in that method with an arrow, with a drop-down arrow like this, and a little line that links two objects together. Now, we can hide models and freeze models in here as well. We can click on the eyeball to hide a model. You'll notice that the Catwoman box here will hide when I click the eyeball. I can also click on box 008. I can open up Nightwing, Robin, and hide them. And it also has a freeze menu option as well. So let's go back to our scene layer manager right here. You'll notice that that eyeball is here too. We can hide models and we can freeze models. So don't forget that both menus are pretty much similar. It's just this one works in layers, and this is why I prefer the actual layer manager. Working in layers is much easier. And then when you want to get down to rigging characters or linking objects together, you can always go into the hierarchy menu to make sure everything's organized correctly. but the layer manager will work just fine for our modeling needs at the moment. So our next step is actually going into more details of our models. I'd like you to create a few varieties of boxes, just like what I have on here, or maybe just a few different boxes. I'll actually reset my scene really quick so that I'm on par with you. Don't save. Yes. And I'm going to create 2 boxes. I'd like you to create 2 boxes as well. I want you to name both boxes Batman and Robin. We can do so by clicking on name and color here, and we can change the color and the name of the object. Or I can just left click in our scene and layer manager, turn the bar blue, left click again, and then we can actually rename it right here. So I'm going to call this one Batman is green, and Robin is the blue one. Don't forget that we can always change our color really quickly by going to name and color over here. You'll notice that the names have changed in these boxes as well if you left click on them one more time. I'm just going to change Robin to red and Batman to black. There we go. We now have our Batman and Robin cubes. So what I'd like you to do is left click on one of these objects. That object is now selected, right? Of course, left clicking will select an object. We are in select object mode, which is Q on your keyboard, and our object is now selected. Remember that W, E, R, or move, rotate, and scale tools, they're also available to us. But I'm just going to push Q just so I select my objects currently. I can now right click on my object. Right click will bring up a whole new menu for our object, which includes a whole bunch of different options for hiding, freezing, and a whole bunch of different object properties. We're going to go down the list a little bit and quickly go through some of the options. Viewport lighting and shadows, we can lock the lights, we can lock the shadows to this object. We can isolate this selection, meaning that we only have access to this object and nothing else. We can unfreeze and freeze the selection. So for those who are wondering how to freeze and unfreeze, we can actually click here, freeze selection, and unfreeze all. Now you can't unfreeze just the specific selection, but you can do so in our scene and layer managers, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. However, if you want to freeze an object currently, you can always just click freeze selection. We can unhide by name, unhide all objects. We can hide the unselected objects, meaning anything that isn't selected will be hidden, or we can hide what we have selected currently. We can save the state of this object, meaning that we can create a new state set, where you can actually have this object in this place and we can load it back up to this place. However, I wouldn't recommend using that. It's just kind of a mess, and most of the time it actually doesn't work well if you start modifying an object. So don't worry about that. The only options I would worry about currently are the unfreeze all, freeze selection, hide selection, the hide and unhide selections. You can see we have the move, rotate, and scale tools right here. So instead of clicking WER, you can actually right click on an object and click on one of these, and we can move, rotate, and scale. We can also have placement, select similar. Where it becomes really important to remember how to access different features of your object is actually in this menu right here called Object Properties. If we open up Object Properties, you're going to see a menu pop up called Object Properties, and you're actually going to be able to see our name of our object. We can rename it again right here. We can change the color here, and it actually gives us some information about our model. The X, Y, and Z dimensions of our models, how many vertices are on our model, how many faces are on our model, material name. Very important to remember these because when it comes to exporting these for a game or a movie, having them named correctly, sized correctly, knowing the polygon count, that's going to become really important. And all you have to do is right click on an object and go to Object Properties to figure all this out. You can also see here there's different submenus, which we're going to go through right now. We have Interactivity, which has hide and freeze options. We can actually hide and freeze our objects simply by clicking these and clicking on OK. But that's for you to play around with. Just play around with hide and freeze if you need to do that. Below that, we have display properties. Now, this is really important, and I will teach you a couple of these hotkeys as well. You're going to notice there's an option called see-through. We can actually make our object completely see-through so that while we're modeling it, we can see any images in the background, we can see behind our model. And that's going to become really important when it comes to character modeling. So we're definitely going to get into more detail about that. We can display it as a box. Backspace cull means that it will render the back of polygons. Remember that if we have a polygon that is made of 2 triangles, a single polygon can be viewed from one side, but the other side will seem transparent to a camera. This will disable that and allow both sides to be visible to the camera. Edges only, which is a fine default option for 3D Studio Max. Vertex ticks, trajectory, ignore extents. We won't be playing around with any of these. They're not necessary to play around with. But there is one option that is vital to 3D Studio Max that I would like you to turn off. and that's called show frozen and gray. Normally when you freeze an object, as we saw, I will cancel this menu really quick to show you again, I'm going to freeze Robin. What happens is it goes gray. But let's say I really want to see the colors, and later on when we assign textures and materials, it will still appear as gray, but let's say you still want to see the materials and textures or colors or any of that. We need to actually turn show frozen and gray off. So I right click on the object, I go to object properties, and I turn off show frozen and gray. I click OK. Now if I freeze my object, you'll notice that Robin still stays red, and I can no longer select the object, but we have a nice red cube there that represents our Robin character. I'm going to unfreeze our objects. Now, I can go to my scene and layer manager, find Robin and click frozen, or I can right click in the scene, anywhere in the scene, even on another object, and I can click on unfreeze all. Robin is now completely unfrozen. We can go back to object properties and we'll go through the last menu here. So we went through interactivity, which basically gave us a hide and freeze option. We have our display properties, which allows us to make an object transparent. We can turn show frozen and gray off. We can change our name and our colors. We also have rendering control, which allows us to change how the object is viewed in our scene and in our renderer. We can change the visibility amount, so if you want to make something more transparent, lower this to 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. 1 means that it is at full power, full visibility. It is a thick object. We also have the options for renderable, inherit visibility, visible to camera. They're all ticked on, so I wouldn't worry about changing any of these unless you want something invisible to the camera. We're just going to click OK and move on to the next step here. So, the next step for playing around with this is beginning to make objects transparent. As I said before, you can go to Object Properties and you can click on the See-Through option here. However, what I would recommend is to learn another shortcut key. So we're actually going to click on an object. So we have Robin highlighted. The shortcut key for making something transparent is called X-ray. So hold Alt and click X. The easiest way to remember that is X-ray. Hold Alt and click X. You're going to notice my object becomes gray and slightly see-through. You can see through this object, and I'll maximize my viewport so you get a better view of this. You can see through my object, and I can see the black square shape right behind it. If I had textures or materials or a bunch of other objects, which I will create right now, I will create several spheres of different colors. You're going to notice we can see through our object to other objects. At any point in time, we can click on our object and click Alt-X again to make it fully opaque, to make it a thick object, or we can click Alt-X again to make it transparent. This becomes a good process when it comes to 3D modeling something. So I suggest you practice this a lot, remembering the hotkey Alt-X, remembering the scene and layer managers, playing around with it, dragging objects on top of other objects inside the hierarchy if you want to link them together, and for here, creating new layers to work with. What I would suggest you do at the current moment is go back to your box character scene and organize your scene into different layers. Add an environment, if you will, add more little characters running around, and make different layers for everything in your scene how you see fit. One for character, one for street, one for buildings, and this way we can start managing our scene a little bit better. So for instance, I will make an example with you right now. I will create one box, two box, just like that. I will create a couple of block buildings, and I'm going to copy one by holding the Shift key, going to the Move tool, and moving it. I'm going to create a copy. I'm going to copy all of these. So remember our old shortcut keys as well as different options for selecting an object. Remember that if you push hold Control and left click on another object while one object is highlighted, you will select multiple objects. And if you hold Alt, you will deselect an object. So hold Control and left click to add an object to your selection. Hold Alt to deselect it. So now I have two sides of my city street. I'm going to create a sidewalk. And I'm going to create the actual street itself. I'm just going to use cubes for now to make it a little bit easier on us. And I'm going to copy this side of the street. And now I have a city street. Let's say I want to make a character really quick. I'm just going to make a couple of boxes to resemble characters. And maybe even a car. Like so. We have a car, we have characters, and we have buildings. What I'd like to do now is everything is organized into our zero default layer. First thing I'd like you to do is rename your objects to the proper part. If your tail has 6 parts, name it tail 1, tail 2, tail 3, tail 4, tail 5, tail 6. If it has multiple buildings, call those buildings by names, if you will. So I have, let's call this building 1, and we can rename it on the right-hand side of our screen here and change the color, or we can go to this side of our screen. So I can left-click here, left-click one more time, building 2, building 3, and start renaming it. Especially if you're working on your scene, like I said, suggest in your scene with your box character, I'd like you to maybe expand upon your box character and add a small city environment, some buildings, a mailbox, garbage can, depending on your skill level. Add as much as you'd like, and much detail, just using simple standard primitives right here. These standard primitives, I'd like you to expand upon your scene and add more. Now I'm going on to the sidewalks. I'm going to rename it sidewalk 1. Going to rename the sidewalk 2, and rename it however you see fit. Even if you want to go to right click and object properties and rename it there, that's fine with me as well. I'm going to call this one street, car 1, and I'll call this part car 2, and character 1, and character 2. Now that everything in my scene and layer manager is renamed, everything is named building 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sidewalk 1. I'm going to create new layers. So I know I need to create a new layer right here, the plus sign right here. And I'm going to call this one buildings. I'm going to select all my buildings. I'm going to left click on one, hold control, left click on another, till all my buildings are selected. Now I'm going to drag my entire building selection onto the buildings layer. So now you see all my buildings are on my building layer. I can actually freeze them all just by clicking on the layer title, or hide them all just by clicking the buildings layer. I can also minimize that layer to save room in my scene and layer manager, making it much easier for me to work in. And you can do the same thing with the cars. And here's a different way of creating a new layer that will automatically benefit us. If I grab all the parts of the car, I have car 1 and car 2, and then while they're selected, I create a new layer, they automatically will go to that new layer, making it much easier for me. Instead of having to create a new layer, selecting them, attaching to the layer, highlight them before you create the layer so that they're selected, then create a new layer, and they'll automatically be attached to your new layer. So this is now my car layer, and I'll have a character layer. So I'm going to grab these two characters. I'm going to create a character layer, name it character, and then I will call this last one. I'm going to grab the sidewalks and the street, and I'm going to call this the street layer. Oop, I hit too many buttons by accident. My apologies. So now when I go in my scene layer manager, in the layer part, I have buildings, car, character, street, and these are all layers that have objects in them. You can see the arrow to drop down the layer to expand it. And you can see all the different parts of your scene. So, like I suggest, either create a new box character scene or use your old box character scene. Create a small environment for your character, maybe add a few things all around depending on your skill level, as I said. Create new layers, rename the objects appropriately to what part of the body they are or what the object currently is, and have that all contained together. Try and practice a few times, maybe create a few different types of objects using boxes, cones, spheres, using standard primitives, and you'll get the hang of that really quick. This is going to be really important when it comes to finalizing our objects that are more high polygon, high detail, and when we start creating environments, this is a good way to handle the memory on your computer, as well as being able to organize something efficiently so that when you work with other people in the industry, they understand and can work in your scenes inside 3D Studio Max very easy by going through your layer manager. I hope this is very helpful. This is your layer and scene manager tutorial, and if you have any questions at all, you feel free to email me. Thank you very much, students. Have yourself a great day, and look forward to the next video.